Excellent. Welcome, everyone. This is the Boston Clojure Group meetup for October. And tonight we have a presentation for you on Fulcro. The full title is Rapid Application Development with Fulcro, and it's going to be presented by Chris O'Donnell, one of our longtime members and multiple presenter. We've enjoyed his presentations very much in the past, and we look forward again tonight to seeing some interesting material. So just to let everyone know, we are recording now. So we plan to post this on YouTube sometime this week. So anybody who couldn't attend today can view it. So with that, why don't you take it away, Chris? And we can see after about an hour where we stand and whether we're going to have a break and come back. But we'll do that only if we need to. So go ahead, Chris.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, thanks to the organizers for keeping this meetup going through some interesting times. And thanks for having me. All right. And yeah, please let me know. Can everyone hear me? Okay. All right. Awesome. I'm gonna share my screen here. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'll just do a quick, we're hiring also. I work at a company called Reify Health. We build software that helps people run clinical trials. We were small when I joined, but we recently raised some money at a $2.2 billion valuation, which is pretty nuts. And we're hiring for all levels of engineers. You don't need Clojure experience. I'll post a link in the chat to our careers page. All right, cool. All right, so with that out of the way, oh, come on, Zoom, please. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna open up the presentation. So the plan is to talk about a library called Fulcru Rad. I am not the library author, that's Tony K, but I have been playing with Fulcro for a while now. I've written a few blog posts about Fulcro itself, and recently I've been exploring Fulcro Rad, just trying to understand through some side projects what it's like to develop with it. So I just wanted to share some of my experience with you guys and hopefully give you guys a bit of flavor of what it's like to use the library. Okay, so here's the plan. I have some brief introductions just to give you guys some kind of foundational high-level understanding that's helpful for understanding what's going on. So we'll start by just talking about Fulcro itself, which Fulcro Rad is built on top of. We'll talk about Pathom, which is a library that really underpins a lot of the backend implementation of Fulcro Rad. We'll talk about Fulcro Rad itself briefly, and then the meat of it will be we'll actually build some stuff with Fulcro Rad, because I think that's really the most revealing way to learn about software. Definitely, please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. I would much rather pause to answer questions than have people just be confused, starting at some point in the presentation and proceeding onwards. So please feel free to do so. All right, so we're going to kick it off with an introduction to Fulcro. What is Fulcro? So Fulcro is a library for single-page, full-stack web applications in Clojure and ClojureScript. You will definitely see throughout this presentation that Fulcro is a data-centric library. Fulcro has, Fulcro takes into account the fact that you're not building, for the most part, a single page application in isolation. Almost every single page application needs to communicate with the backend. And so Fulcro has a kind of philosophy on how that should be done. And Fulcro is pragmatic. Tony K wrote Fulcro in order to build real software. And it has a bunch of tools for helping you solve common problems like routing and building forms and validation, that kind of stuff. There are really, in my opinion, two main ideas that Fulcro is built around. The first is the idea of component local queries. And so that just means each component has some query data attached to it that declares what the component needs to render. And we'll see an example of that in just a second. But those queries can be used to get data out of the front-end application state. Fulcro espouses the kind of common in the Clojure script community practice of just having an atom with a map inside it and putting, the vast majority of your application state into that map. Queries can also be used to fetch remote data. So because a component declares the data that it needs to render, you can say, hey, go get me the data that this component needs from a remote source. And you get the data back and put it in application state. And there you go, you can render your component now. The other main idea that Fulcro is built around is a normalized application state. And I mean normalized in the sense of a relational database where you try to prevent duplication of data in your application state. I'm not sure, probably any of you that have worked with a larger single page application have run into cases where you end up with the same data is stored in a few different places in your application state, and trying to keep them all in sync is a huge pain in the butt. And Fulcro has kind of a principled answer to that in the way that it stores its state. All right. I find that examples are always very helpful for understanding. So here's a guiding example that's what your application might look like for a simple to-do application where you're rendering a to-do that also has some information about the author of the to-do. And this is what the Fulcro application state might look like. So the normalized application state is a map where the top level keys are tables, which is a way of organizing different types of entities typically. And each table is a map from ID to entity map. So here you can see the to-do with ID 1 is nested under the 1 key, and the user with ID 2 is nested under the 2 key. And I want to bring your attention that the normalized bit comes in here. So rather than putting the to-do author information nested inside the to-do map, we store what's called a ref. And this is literally just like a vector that if you passed it to get in with the application state, it would take you to the user map. So if you have several different to-dos that have the same author, they'll all have the same ref here. And when you update the author in its table, you'll see the same data gets displayed for all of those to-dos.
So it's just like a foreign key then, Chris, right?
Exactly, very much like a foreign key in a relational database.
Is Fulcro actively aware that that's a ref, or is that just a convention?
Fulcro is actively aware that this is a ref.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, Fulcro helps you a lot. It's possible to store your application state like this using something like Reframe, but you'll find that the bookkeeping involved in managing these refs is non-trivial. And Fulcro helps you with that.
What happens if you have a list of length to where the first thing's a keyword, but you don't want it to be a ref?
So there's some, we'll get to that. I can touch on that on the next slide. That's a good
I don't want to get
question.
too far ahead of things.
Any other questions?
Yeah, is there a provision like to guard against cycles, like referencing cycles? Or
No, you can have cycles.
whatever. Okay.
All right. So that's what the application state might look like. This is what components might look like. This is kind of pseudocode. There's like some stuff that's missing from here for these to be like working Fulcro components, but they're here to get the message across with the code that fits on the slide. So if we look first at the to-do author component, you can see that it has a query attached to it that has a user ID, a username, and user email attributes. So that's the declaration of the data that this component needs to render. It needs an entity that has these attributes. And you can see there's just some like markup down here that's saying how it should be rendered. It also has an ident. The ident is used to tell you where in the application state the component's props are coming from. So this user ID says this component's data comes from the user ID table, and you can use the user ID attribute from its props to tell you which entity it's rendering. The to-do item, so this is getting to Jeremy's question. The to-do item, just like the to-do author, it needs a to-do ID and to-do title attributes. But there's also this map in here with to-do author, and then this comp get query to-do author. So this is called a join, and this is the way that we compose queries in Fulcro. You compose queries by literally like putting the nested components query inside the parent component. So this expands to this vector right here. And the join is how you know, is how Fulcro knows that it needs to take that ref, that two tuple, and traverse into a new place in your application state. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Jeremy. All right. Any more questions?
I suspect you're probably going to answer this soon, but is UI to do author like a magic auto-generated function that renders the to do author component?
No, it's not magic. If this were real code, there would be a def that creates this function.
Okay.
But yeah, there's like limited space on the slide, so I'm being brief.
Is there going to be issues with like circular namespace requirements? Because just one of the things that tripped me up in Reframe was trying to make sure that I could reference, say, all my keywords or namespace keywords correctly or so on without getting into circular things. And this seems like now your queries, if you want to refer to something that's somewhat nested like this, you also have to have your components in the same order as well.
Yeah, you can get around it by like declaring things if you need to. I haven't had issues with circular component dependencies personally. I have, if you use like fully qualified keywords, you have to be careful about where you put those keywords, because it's easy to end up with circular dependencies on those keyword namespaces. But in practice, it hasn't been a problem for me with the components. Cool. Okay. So just to give a kind of little bit of an idea of some of the value that you get out of these component local queries. So here's the query from our to-do item component. And you could imagine, actually Pathom has a function that does this, converting it into a GraphQL query if you have a GraphQL query that's serving your to-dos. And without writing really any custom data fetching code, you could convert your EQL query into a GraphQL query, send it over the network to get your to-do information, and then merge that into your application state. And that is something that you can do like with just a little bit of configuration. So kind of like cool stuff that comes out of the data-driven orientation of Fulcro. Okay, moving on. What is Pathom? So, and by the way, I think I skipped over this a little bit. These queries, the component local queries, are in a format called EQL, Eden Query Language, which is just really this. At its base level, it's keywords, keyword attributes, and then joins, these maps. All right, so what is Pathom? Pathom is a library that helps you with getting EQL queries. You give Pathom an EQL query and it gives you data back that satisfies that query. And so this is probably looks kind of similar to GraphQL for anyone who's familiar with GraphQL. But Pathom is attribute-based rather than entity-based. And we'll see, so you'll always use fully qualified. You don't technically have to use fully qualified keywords, but you're probably going to use fully qualified keywords with Pathom, or namespace keywords at least. So to give you a flavor for what Pathom does, this is the parser is kind of the top level construct that Pathom gives you. And the parser is just a function of two arguments. The first argument is an env argument, which just captures some context that you need to be available to you as you're going out and getting the data that you need. So for example, you might inject your connection pool to your database. If you're fetching the data on behalf of some user, you might put some user information like roles, permissions, user ID, that kind of thing is what you'll put in the env. And the second argument is an EQL query. So here, this is an EQL query that might be used to fetch the data for a list of to-do items. And what it gives you back is data satisfying the query, kind of tree-shaped data. So here you can say we have to-do all to-dos, which is just a list of to-do items that have the nested author information in them. And the like kind of building blocks when you're using Pathom are what are called resolvers. And when I talked about Pathom being attribute-based, this is where that really comes in. Resolvers have a very simple contract. You give them an entity that satisfies their input requirements. So this all to-dos resolver, it doesn't require any input attributes. So you can call it to provide data for any entity. The to-do item resolver requires an entity that has a to-do ID attribute. If you give the resolver an entity that satisfies its input contract, it promises to give you data satisfying its output contract. So here, the all to-dos resolver promises to give you a map with a key to do all to-dos. And the value will be either a single map with a to-do ID, or in this case, a vector of maps that all have the to-do ID key in them. And similarly, the to-do item resolver promises to give you a map with a to-do title and the to-do author key that has a map with a user ID. And you could kind of see, and these are I mean, you can see the implementations are pretty simple. You're just like getting some to-dos out of the database and putting them in the right form, or getting a single to-do out of the database and formatting it properly. And
Does
hopefully you
Pathom
could.
have, I was
Sorry, go
gonna say,
ahead.
does Pathom have like any utilities to get around 1+n problems?
Yep. Yeah, Pathom has batch resolvers that you can
Okay.
use to get around the n+1 query problem. Yeah, so hopefully you can kind of see how you would, if you were satisfying this query, Pathom would call first your like all to-dos resolver to get you this to do all to-dos, and a vector of to-do ID items, and the to-do item resolver to get, you know, this bit, and maybe then a user resolver to get the user information given the user ID. Any questions?
So it seems like the parser does more than what you would think of as parsing. The name seems a little misleading there, or am I missing something?
It's a bit of an odd name. Yeah, the name comes from the origins of Pathom. Pathom was kind of born for a different purpose. It was built to help with Next applications, and it's kind of evolved to serve a pretty different role.
Okay.
What is the keyword to-do/keys doing here?
So this is namespace keyword destructuring.
Okay. Yep. I
Yeah.
didn't know if it was just like a special syntax that Pathom used or anything.
Nope, just regular destructuring. So for anyone who doesn't know, if you have a map with the namespace keyword to do /ID, you can destructure it like this, and the ID value here will be the value associated to that keyword.
And the tone returns things that fully match, right? If there are no matches, it just returns an empty thing.
Right. Yeah, and it's possible also to get like partial data, right? Like for example, maybe the all to-dos resolver succeeds in getting the to-do IDs, but then your database connection dies before you can get all the to-dos, and so you just end up with like the to-do IDs, and you can kind of define how to handle that behavior in Pathom.
So what is the database on the other end of this connection? I mean, what kind of protocol are we talking here? What kind of database?
It could be anything. So Pathom is kind of an abstraction layer that's built on top of really any data source that you want. You could be getting these from a REST API, you could be getting them from Datomic or Postgres, or it doesn't really matter.
And so Fulcro is full stack, right? So is the Pathom stuff running on your backend?
That's right. Although you can also run Pathom in your front end if you want.
But it's roughly a relational model, though. You've got tables, you've got references, much like you would see in a SQL database of some sort.
To a degree, but these are open maps rather than like a relational database table that's closed. So you can put you can put different attributes onto maps.
So more like a columnar database.
Kind of. Okay, I'm going to keep this moving in the interest of getting to the end here. We're getting close to the live coding. So we have, with a high level understanding of Fulcro and Pathom, we can talk a little bit about Fulcro Rad. And I think it's easy to have misunderstandings about the purpose of Fulcro Rad. And I've seen Tony K talking about this a fair amount in the Fulcro channel. So Fulcro Rad is a library, not a framework. It provides you with components, with UI components and with backend queries that can help you to accomplish common tasks quickly. But those UI components and queries are put inside of a larger Fulcro application, as called, just like you would call any other library functions. So you're not like bound to use everything with Fulcro Rad if you decide to use Fulcro Rad for some things. Its purpose is to make common tasks easy. So lots and lots of applications, lots of companies and people need to make CRUD interfaces. Lots of people need to make kind of like simple reporting applications that do largely the same things. And so Fulcro Rad is all about getting rid of the boilerplate out of those tasks. Fulcro Rad is pluggable. All of the different pieces of Fulcro Rad are built on top of configuration, and you are capable of putting your own UI components, putting your own queries in place of what people typically use with Fulcro Rad. And similar to Pathom, Fulcro Rad is heavily attribute-based. Cool. Any final questions before we hop into code?
Does Fulcro Rad supplant the use of, like, would you use Fulcro Rad instead of using Fulcro for your project?
No, Fulcro Rad, you could think of it almost like a component library and query library that you can use from within a Fulcro application. So for use cases that are suitable to Fulcro Rad, like you can use Fulcro Rad. For other things that don't fit as nicely into the kind of like CRUD or reporting paradigm, you can just use regular Fulcro.
Okay, got it.
And you might have cases where it makes sense to use Fulcro Rad at the start. And, you know, as you build something out, you need to have something that's more complex, and then you change it to be just regular Fulcro. Okay, cool. So I am going to hop into Emacs. Is my font size okay for everyone?
It seems good.
All right, I don't hear anyone yelling in complaint. So let me actually. All right. So this is a Boston Rad demo project that's built out of Fulcro Rad demo, which is something that Tony K built. It's a demo application built using Fulcro Rad, and it serves kind of as living documentation. It has lots of examples of different use cases of Fulcro Rad. I've just simplified it a little bit for demo purposes here. So briefly, the structure of this application. Inside the model folder, we have our data model definitions. So these are CLJC files because they're referenced from the front end and the back end. And they include our attribute definitions and resolver definitions. We have some in the components library. These are kind of like server configuration stuff. So configuration of Pathom, of this project uses Datomic. So some Datomic queries like ring, all of that stuff. And inside the UI folder are our UI components. And these are CLJC because they are in the Fulcro Rad demo, and I didn't feel like changing them to CLJS, but they could be CLJS files for my purposes. I'm not going to do any server rendering here. All right, and I'm already have a REPL running, so I am going to get it started up here. All right, and we have now, we should have our Fulcro application running on localhost 3000. Please, everyone, say your prayers to whatever demo gods you believe in, that we won't run into difficulties. All right, so
My
this is
demos are always perfect.
always. So this is
I've already seen a failed demo today, so the gods were appeased by that. So I think you're.
Oh, thank goodness! Thank you so much. That makes me feel better. Yeah. Okay. So this is a Fulcru Rad demo. This is like an example of a like internal e-commerce admin application. You can do like account management, inventory management, invoices, reports. There's like just different things. I'm not going to give you guys a tour of this. You should feel free to look it up and check it out on your own time. What I want to do is build a new feature inside of this application so you guys get a feel for what that looks like. So the use case that we're satisfying here is some representatives of this company are going to a conference and they want to keep track of people that they meet at the conference, and they hate Salesforce. So they don't want to use that. They just want a little thing inside their admin application that they love dearly. And so that's what we've been tasked with building. Just a little widget that will allow them to create and update contacts. We'll need to include a name, email address, and optionally an address in those contacts. And we'll also need a list view that they can use to see the contacts that they've added, and maybe some sorting and searching. Make sense? Hearing no objection. All right, cool. Let's do it. All right, so the first place that we're going to start is with the data model. And I'm actually just going to take a look at the account file first, just to give you guys a bit of flavor of what those look like. So let's open up account.cljc. Ignore the prolific namespace declarations mostly, but I'll just point out a kind of pattern that we see with Fulcro Rad. So with different, there's a few different features. So there's like the ability to define attributes, and there's also this attribute options namespace. And you'll see there's also form, Fulcro Rad form, and Fulcro Rad form options. These options namespaces are kind of interesting. So we can look here. We're defining an ID attribute whose namespace keyword is account ID, and it's a UUID typed attribute. And if we look, this attribute definition, the rest of it is just a map, which is like a bag of data. And different pieces of Fulcro Rad can look at different namespace keywords in here. So this includes, if we look AO identity, true, that means that this is an identity attribute. It's kind of like a primary key that you can use in your data store. Now, this AO is the attributes options. And typically with Clojure, you would kind of expect this to be a keyword. Like that's very common, is to just have a configuration map that has a bunch of keywords in it. But Fulcro Rad kind of takes an interesting technique. I'm just going to go into the source here. This is the Fulcro Rad attribute options namespace. And you can see this just has a whole bunch of defs that have doc strings and are just a keyword. That's it. Like this entire namespace is just that. And this is super helpful because it gives you a way to actually like see what these configuration attributes represent. So here, like if you're browsing through attribute definitions, you can just look at the doc string and see, oh, okay, This is a Boolean. It indicates that the attribute is used to identify entities in a data store. Whereas if it were a keyword, you would be kind of on your own to figure out what it was supposed to mean. So kind of a cool thing with Fulcru Rad. AO schema. So this tells us that this attribute will be persisted to the database. Theoretically, you can have different schemas. I haven't done that personally, but I think that's the purpose of this AO schema production, is that you could have other schemas, other data stores that your attributes get persisted to. And if we look at the email attribute on account, you can see that that has AO identities. And this tells us which, what kind of primary key an entity has to have in order to support an account email attribute. So in this case, you can only attach an account email to an entity that has an account ID on it. And you can define other metadata as well on this attribute, like it's a required attribute. We can see again AO schema production. And here's a different type of metadata that we've attached to this attribute. So this DO here is the database adapters datomic options. So also attached to this keyword or to this attribute is some information about how it should be persisted in the database. So for those of you who are not familiar with datomic, this is saying that you shouldn't have two different entities with the same email, with the same account email value. And this is data that gets passed in when you're defining your datomic schema. And you can put there's like other types of form configuration and report configuration that you can also put into these attribute maps.
Apologies if you said this and I missed it, but what is the identities attribute doing there?
So this tells you what kinds of entities you can put an account email attribute on. So this says, in order to attach an account email attribute to an entity, it has to have an account ID.
So by default, you can put any attribute on any entity unless they have an identities constraint.
Right. Yeah, and this, I mean, this is
based instead of entity based, right? That's what we're seeing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is really necessary for persistence. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so let's start defining our contact data model. In the interest of time, I'm just going to copy this model account namespace definition, contact.cljc, and I'm going to replace this with contact. And we are going to define some attributes here as well. I'm like a little bit behind pace, so I'm going to do some copy pasting here. So I've just taken the account ID and the account email, which we're also going to need for contacts, and just did a little search and replace account with contact. We're also going to need a name attribute. So let's define that. Def header name, contact name. This is going to be a string as well. And again, the contact name should be attached to, let's get the REPL in the right place so we can have some, there we go. Contact ID. This is going to get persisted to the production schema.
And that's a keyword contact ID, right? In line 33. Is that a keyword?
Yes, it should be a keyword. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
It's
like
one
mob programming. Yeah,
that's right.
All right. The name will also be required. but the name doesn't have to be unique, so we're not going to add that constraint. Now, the other thing that I mentioned was address. And if we look in the account namespace, there's actually already, the account already has an address reference. And if we look at this, so this is primary address, account primary address. This is a ref. This means it's an attribute that points to a different entity. The AO target, if we look at the documentation, required for ref attributes, qualified keyword of an identity true attribute that identifies the entity that this points to. So this is saying like, this points to an entity that's uniquely identified by its address ID attribute and its cardinality 1. And this is like exactly the same thing that we need in our.
So you're going to replace it and then attribute, or you're going to replace the target. You're going to reference it and replace the target. Can you reuse it?
Right. Yeah, we're going to have this. So like our conception of a contact will actually be 2 different entities. It will be the contact entity and the referenced address entity. Yeah, I'm using this like account attribute as an example just to illustrate that we already have,
I see.
There's already an address model that has like a whole bunch of stuff in it, and we can reuse it for a contact case. So go over to contact, def adder address, contact address. This is a ref. Let's just grab this here. Okay, so like
Chris,
I said.
so Chris, this isn't feeling like normalization if you're copying everything instead of referencing it.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
we're
still the
copying
same
attribute
it's still
definitions.
the same address, like entity, the same address table, right?
That's
Conceptual
right.
table.
Yeah. Yeah, you could theoretically have, you wouldn't with this, with the way that we have this set up, but you could theoretically have an account that has the same address as a contact. I'm just copy pasting because the code is similar. And one thing that I want to point out here that's maybe a bit to your point. So this is some more datomic configuration. This DB is component true, has to do with when you delete or retract in datomic parlance a contact. By passing this DB is component true, that means that the address will also be removed when the contact is. And this is it. This is our full, we don't need that comment. This is our full contact data model. Not quite actually, sorry. The last thing that we need is an attribute that we can use to get at our list of contacts. And this is like in the presentation, in the query, we had this to do all to-dos attribute. We need kind of the same thing that we'll use to help us get at all of the contacts. So we're going to define an all contacts attribute, contact all contacts, which is also going to be a ref. And like we saw in the doc string, every ref needs a target. This is listing all of the contacts. So the target will be contact ID because we're listing contact entities. And this is not something that will persist in the database. This is kind of like a virtual attribute that will be computed whenever we query for it. And there's some kind of like syntactical sugar for defining the equivalent resolver to our all to-dos resolver for this case, like an all contacts resolver. And that has the AOPC output. So this is just the output of the resolver that we want to define, which would be contact, all contacts, contact ID. So this means that it's going to return something that looks like contact all contacts, contact ID 1, contact ID 2. These will be UUIDs because those are contact IDs, but hopefully that helps make this concrete. And also to define this resolver, we need the actual resolver. So there's this AOPC resolve attribute that gives us a resolver. We're just going to pull out the query params out of this as env. Oops. And we don't care about what we're querying for. This is just going to be a backend thing because we're going to query the database to get all of our contacts. So we're going to CLJ we want to return contact all contacts. And then we have a database queries namespace. So I'm going to pretend that there's a get all contacts query, which we'll have to write in just a second. And query params.
Are resolvers always defined in MIME like that, or can you also?
No, if
Yeah,
you look,
you could just put a function reference there, I guess.
Yeah, so you can also define resolvers as actual resolvers here. So you can see like this is a mutation rather than a like query resolver, but okay. Any other questions? The last thing is by convention, we'll define an attributes vector at the bottom of this namespace that has all of the attributes that we've defined. So ID, name, email, address, all contacts. And the reason for this is there's no magic in these def adder definitions. This is actually a very small macro that does some syntax checking, but this is definitely like this bottoms out at def all contacts and then a map. That's it. There's no like registry that def adder puts these attributes into magically when you define them. They're just maps. So this attributes will just be a vector that collects all of the attributes that we care about here. And the way to integrate them into all of the machinery that like does stuff for us is to go into this model.cljc file that's one directory up. And you can see here that this is just like taking all of the attributes from our different model namespaces and smushing them together in one big vector. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to add contact attributes. So now contact attributes is, it's in there, but we have one more open to do, which is we need to implement this database query. So let's do that. This is called get all contacts. And it's very similar to get all accounts. So once again, we're going to just do a little bit of copy pasting and search and replace. And I just want to point out, I mentioned earlier that the env is a place where you can stuff your like database connections and stuff. And you can see here that that's exactly what Fulcro Rad has done. Inside of our env, we have Datomic databases production. That's the way of injecting that dependency into our resolvers. Okay, and then this is not a Datomic talk, so I'm just gonna write this query. This is just getting all of our contact IDs out of Datomic and turning them into a vector of maps that have the key contact ID and then the contact ID. And we're going to evaluate some namespaces here. They're successfully evaluating. That's always a good sign. All right. So we've just done some declaration of attributes and written one little datomic query. And we have actually already written all of the backend code that we're going to need for our feature. Everything is already done.
Really?
Yes.
That's cool. So is it generating resolvers for the rest of those attributes that are going to pull them out of Datomic?
That's exactly it. And it's not, there's no magic. Everything is explicit with Fulcru Rad. So you can see there's this automatic resolvers var that's taking the all attributes definition that we just added our contact attributes for. And this is generating some like default Fulcro Rad resolvers. And this is defining some datomic resolvers. So those are just functions that take attributes and turn them into resolvers that can get data, that can fetch those attributes from the database.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. And also this start database will take those attributes and turn them into datomic schema and transact that into the database. And there's like a bunch of other stuff that helps with form submission, middleware, and all of it is like everything that cares about your attributes takes them as an argument, and you can look at it to see what it's doing or replace it with something if you want to replace it. Because it's easier than trying to figure out which namespaces to evaluate, I'm just going to restart my REPL, or not the full REPL, you know, I'm not a savage, but this is just an easier way to do that. Okay. All right, so we have, all right, we're doing okay on time. Okay, so this is, we have not written any front end code. So this app looks the same, but I just want to double check. So this is Fulcro Inspect, which is a Chrome DevTools plugin that's invaluable for working with Fulcro applications. So this is the Index Explorer. It lets you look at the attributes that you've defined and like the resolvers that are getting them for you. And so I'm happy to see that our contact attributes are in here. So they are available to make queries. And if we go into this EQL helper, you can actually, oops, let's load the Pathom index so we can auto-complete. Contact all contacts, and let's just grab the contact name and the contact email. And I'm going to run that query, and we get contact all contacts empty vector because we haven't created any contacts. So that makes perfect sense. But our backend is in place. We are ready to implement some front end features. But before I do that, I just want to check and see if anyone has questions.
I'm liking the lack of magic.
It's nice and very intentional.
So Fulcro Rad also generated a mutation somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't use the generated one, I mean, what is there opportunity and need for you to write your own or customize or do something other than default?
Yep, totally. And you can actually see examples of that. For example, in the account namespace, here we have custom mutations for setting an active account. That one's kind of trivial, but also things like checking the session. These are things that like don't really make sense to auto-generate. And so you just define them custom. You could also write def resolvers here if you wanted to. These are all just happen to be mutations.
Cool.
So are the resolvers DP specific, or are they just an abstraction?
The resolvers are EQL specific. They're very much a Pathom construction. You can use them outside of Fulcro. We actually use Pathom at Reify Health with Reframe, not Fulcro.
Okay. You still have to write the queries behind the resolvers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks.
It was interesting that you talked about using Fulcro with GraphQL. This is basically GraphQL, right?
Right. I mean, there's a syntax.
Not exactly, but I'm not. That's a bit of a rabbit hole. I'm not sure if I want to go into that right this second.
Okay, fair enough.
There's an overlap, right? I mean, there's an
Yes.
intersection that we're exercising. We're seeing in this simple example, right?
Yeah, they're solving similar problems for sure.
Because this one's attribute based and GraphQL is
Yes.
entity based.
Correct. That's the main distinction between them.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to move on and implement the UI. The first thing that I'm going to do is make a form so that we can create new contacts and edit contacts. And I'm going to be a slightly better citizen. Account forms. I'm just going to grab the namespace here. Contact forms.cljc. Okay, so all I've done is change the namespace definition to be contact forms, and I've pulled in the contact model instead of the account model here. All right, so we want to define a form. You do that with form def sc form. We're going to call this, contact form. And this is a Fulcro component. It takes this and its props, just like the example components that we saw in the presentation. And this is just a macro. Again, this is just a macro that builds a big Fulcro component for you. It does a lot of work for you, but it's really just building a Fulcro component. That's all. Now, this is a form, and there's a similar form options namespace. I know that there's a FOID, which is going to be the contact ID. And I'm just going to pull up this. Oops, let's go into the right namespace here so we can go in here. This is the form options namespace. It should look really similar to the attribute options namespace. It's just a bunch of vars with docstrings that evaluate two keywords. And I've found it kind of helpful to look through this. If I'm not sure like what's available and what I need to do, it can be helpful to scroll through this namespace to see what configuration I need to add to my, whatever, my form in this case. And I see that ID is required, and that's the attribute that will be the primary key for the form. Attributes is also required. So we're going to add that, and that's just the attributes that we're able to edit in the form. So FO attributes. This is a vector of attributes. So that's going to be contact name, contact email, and contact address. All of those will be editable. We don't care about layout or tab layout. We can give it a title, sure. FO title, edit contact. I'm just scrolling through here, kind of ignoring things that I know I don't want. If you had not seen this namespace before, you would probably do so at a much slower pace. But yeah. And I see route prefix. I want this to be, this is going to be a top level page, and I want to be able to route to it with the HTML5 routing. So I'm going to add FO route prefix contact. And I just keep going through, cancel route controls. Nope, 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 nope. I'm just gonna FO default values. I'm just gonna make sure that the address starts as an empty map. And so now we run it as subforms. So this is actually a really
nil otherwise.
maybe. I'll admit that I didn't have time to explore that one. I've just used what yes. It would be good to try, but I'm not going to do it during a demo.
Wise.
All right, so we have, subforms. So subforms are how you add forms for nested entities inside your form. So in this case, we have a contact entity, and we have, a form that allows you to edit the name and email. But we also want to be able to edit the address that's nested, that's like referred to from the contact. And we use subforms for that. So we're going to add FO subforms, contact address, and this we just need so FOUI. This tells you which UI component will be used for that form. In this case, we're actually already referring an address form, and we're just going to reuse the same form that we built for the, Tony K built for the account entity address form. The other thing, which is, this is one, the documentation is like a little bit spotty in places, which is not a judgment on Tony K. He's put a ton of work into documenting this and building it. But yeah, sometimes the best place to refer to is just the Fulcro Rad demo to see. So we're just going to add form auto create on load to this. And I believe there is nothing else in here that we need to edit. So we've actually built our contact form component. Like, this is a component that allows you to create and edit contacts and the addresses that are nested inside them. So all we have to do is wire this up to fit inside our larger application. And we do that through the UI.cljc file. This is kind of like a root landing page template file that wires things together. So we're going to require our contact forms namespace. We're referring contact form, and we'll get to contact list in just a minute. But for now, we'll just grab contact form. We want this to be a top level routable component. So we're also going to add it to the main router, contact form. And the last thing that we need to do is there's this Navbar at the top. So we're just going to add a new dropdown for contact to the Navbar. And again, we're going to grab the account one, and just because this is basically the same thing, we have contact. We don't have the contact list implemented yet, so we're just going to leave that out. And we have here a dropdown item that when you click it calls form create this contact form. And oh geez, I didn't evaluate this. Okay, well, form create, there we go. This like routes you to the create view of the form. It's also possible to use the same form component to edit an existing entity. So that's what this does. And I believe if I didn't screw anything up, we should see a contact dropdown here at the top. And I can go to new, and we have a form that has the contact name and email address that we can edit, and as well as the address form inside. So Chris Donald, email chris@example.com. Let's just save that for now, just like by itself. It's saved. We created a contact. I can run my query that I ran before, and we see that chris@example.com, Chris O'Donnell is in the database. We can add 1 Happy Street, Boston, Mass, 12345 as an address. and we can query for that. Contact address. Let's just do address city and address street, just to make sure that it's working properly. And we see address street, 1 Happy Street, address city, Boston. So we have a form. We can create and edit stuff with it. That's with like this much code, which is very cool. We are hitting right up at the hour mark. It's just going to be a few more minutes. Is there any objection to taking just a few more extra minutes?
I want to see more. That was really cool.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Cool. All right. I'm just going to take a few more minutes and we'll add the contact list. So there's kind of two basic, two like classes of UI components that Fulcro Rad lets you build. There's forms, which are for creating and editing stuff. And there's reports, which are for viewing stuff. So we're going to create a report that will show us all of our contacts. So report defsc report contact list. This, well, let's just be a good citizen. It's kind of bothering me. This props. And similarly, there's a RO report attributes namespace. And I know that we're going to need a row PK. This just tells us which attribute uniquely identifies the row in our report, which is going to be, let's just go back here. An attribute, okay, attribute, not keyword. So this is going to be contact ID. And we can go into this namespace again, report options, very similar namespace, just a whole bunch of keywords with doc strings. And if you look at the top, it says we require some minimum options. So we added row PK. We're also going to need columns and source attribute. So we're going to add those RO columns. This is kind of what you would expect, the columns in the table that we want to render. So that's just going to be contact name and contact email. And source attribute. If you remember, we defined that like contact all contacts attribute. And that's the entry point for the query to get us this report. And that's the source attribute. Contact all contacts. Now, we also, I'm just going to scroll through this namespace and we'll skip over all of the styling stuff that we don't need and a bunch of other stuff that we're not going to use at the moment. We can add a title, all contacts. We can look at form links a bit later. There's formatting and controls, run on mount. So we do want this to run on mount. Run on mount, true. That just means when the component mounts, it'll load its data rather than waiting for you to trigger it to load its data. Controls, control layout, route. This is going to be another top level component. So RO route contacts. We'll make this routable. Is there anything else in here that we want? Nope. We are looking.
I see it has pagination in there. I saw page size and page count, so that's good because that was one of my questions I was going to look for here, but I see that's in there.
Yep. Yeah, this example is all client side paginated, but yeah, the server side pagination is accounted for.
Do you have to build pagination into your resolvers if you opt for that?
Yes. Yeah, that's something that's like database specific, how you do it. Yeah. Okay, so we have our contact list component. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anything. Let's go back over to the UI namespace and turn it on. So we're going to uncomment the require. We're going to add it to the router because it's also routable contact list. And we're just going to uncomment the nav item. So hopefully this is working. Contact view all is here. So we're going to click on it and we see our list of contacts. Let's add another contact just to make sure that it's working. So we'll add my wife, Lonnie O'Donnell, Lonnie@example.com. Save and done and boom. And this has by default like client side sorting. And you can add other stuff like filtering. Maybe I'll just do one more super quick thing here, which is the ability to add RO form links, contact name, contact form. So this says attach, if you click on the name column, it'll take you to the contact form component. So now these are links, not just text, and I can click on the contact and it'll route me over to the component. And I think I'm going to stop there because I'm already over time. So that's it for the live coding. Let me just give you a quick little closing summary. My perspective, as not the author, but someone who's found this stuff pretty cool. Like from my experience, this seems like something that works pretty well for building easy things quickly and well. There are definitely features in this by default that I probably wouldn't add to an application that I was building custom because it's too much work. But you get them out of the box. Admin applications seem like a great use case for this. I do definitely want to temper people's enthusiasm. If you haven't learned Fulcro, I would strongly recommend that you learn the basics of Fulcro first before diving into Fulcro Rad. This may have looked straightforward in a demo, but I can assure you that I ran into several problems that required debugging kind of as I was figuring this out. And it's difficult to do that if you don't have the Fulcro, a bit of Fulcro background. And also the documentation is the keyword namespace doc strings are super cool. But there's a lot of stuff in Fulcro Rad. And there are some things that could be documented a little better. And that I'd want to emphasize again that that's not a judgment of Tony K. He's done an incredible job with Fulcro and Fulcro Rad. Just there's only so much one person can do. And that's it. Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, definitely open to questions if you guys have them.
So I had a question about, so you have this data schema and now you want to have authorization on the data. Is that something that's built into Fulcro or part of Fulcro Rad or neither?
So Fulcro Rad, I would say not really. There's some client-side authorization it's kind of like a prototype, I would say, built into Fulcro Rad, and that's more about controlling who can view which pages on the front end. If you need to do authorization, so if you have complex authorization, I would probably steer you away from the auto-generated resolvers, just because you're gonna have a really tough time trying to like manipulate them to do what you want. But if you have simple authorization, like you can only do these things if you have a certain permission, you could make your own Pathom plugin that would just reject people that try to do things that don't have that permission. So,
okay,
yeah,
that's often enough. Yeah.
Yep.
And authentication then is that is part of Fulcro.
It's not part of Fulcro, but you can build it into Fulcro. I wrote actually some blog posts a while back about what it looks like to build a Fulcro application. That was before Fulcru Rad came out, but those included like how you could use Fulcro with Auth0, for example.
Oh, cool. Maybe you can point us to those.
Sure.
Are there different options for the backend interfaces that Fulcro can generate, like REST and GraphQL and whatever else?
So Fulcro Rad has, I believe, 3 backend plugins. The Datomic one is definitely the one that's like most fully baked. Tony K is using that in production. There is also a Crux Fulcro Rad plugin and a SQL Fulcro Rad plugin, but
so I was talking about one level up the stack. So like the interface to the web server from the front end.
I see. And are you specifically talking about making like calls from the client or from the back end?
From the client to the back end. Like, I guess what I'm asking is, could you use Fulcro to create a full stack web application that also had like an API that could be hit from other clients?
Yeah, totally. Actually, I gave a talk about that at the Boston Clojure meetup a while ago about using Fulcro with Hasura.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in person, not recorded. But I have like an example GitHub repo that does that I can provide a link to.
Yeah, that'd be very cool.
So I think you mentioned forms validation as part of RAD. Is that what are its capabilities? Or do you get it automatically, or is it something that you have to add as?
So you get some validation automatically. I can show you briefly here. Specifically the like required attributes, it'll automatically yell at you if you try to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
So like here, email is required. But there's also, you can write validators, which are just arbitrary functions that you can use to validate your forms. So
what about transformations? Is it, would that be like your own plugins, or I mean, how? Because often you need to transform before you put something on the screen and split it up, combine it, whatever, right?
So I don't have personal experience with that. I've seen some transformation attributes in the like, dash options namespaces. I haven't played with them. I expect that you would be able to do kind of basic stuff, but if things are more complex, then you'd probably be better off not using Fulcro Rad.
I mean, if they gave you a function, then that's your open door, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you see the most opportunistic, use of this would be to, for a prototype, for skunkworks, to demonstrate something with a quick UI that's an administrative type of UI? Is that how you're seeing that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Please speak up. All right then, looks like that's a wrap. Excellent presentation, super useful stuff. I think you're going to have some people going out and trying a Fulcro Rad for themselves. Really powerful tool for doing this kind of rapid development. So
cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much for presenting. And why don't we go ahead and stop the recording?